Hello, my name is Alex Landis, and today we'll be talking about rectangular course. And in this lesson, this is either for primarily, actually definitely a private applicant, and it's very similar to patterns, right? Here at Lafayette, we do a lot of pattern work, right? Students, you do your first solo in the pattern typically, or definitely first solo in the pattern. At least that's the way I did it at in my private training, and I know it's the way a lot of people do it here at Purdue as well. Some aids that I would use for this lesson. First of all, I would probably assign them a little bit of homework, a little bit of light reading. In the Airplane Flying Handbook, Chapter 6, I believe, is where this maneuver is discussed. So I definitely have my student read over that so they can come more prepared, and that way we can get all that we can out of this lesson, because if they're ill prepared, then they might not retain as much of the information that we talk about. And so the objective for the rectangular course, the objective for this lesson is that by the end of this, students will at least understand and be able to conceptually see what a rectangular course is and how we enter one, the procedures for them, and such. Not really a complicated maneuver, very simple, as I've said earlier, kind of similar to a traffic pattern, right? So that's kind of how I would model this lesson. I would make it, I'd dumb it down to the student. Definitely not dumb it down to the point where it's silly, but I would definitely make it clear that this is really, if they've been in a pattern, nothing that they haven't seen. Very similar. The only difference, I guess, would be you're not landing, or in an emergency scenario, knowing what you have to have available to you. And any entry for this, because an emergency scenario is always a possibility, right? So again, for the review leading up to this lesson, I would definitely go over again the traffic pattern and what each of the legs are, right? So just to make it clear, I'd potentially, depending on how long I've had the private applicant, I might expect them to know this and ask them, okay, what are the legs of a traffic pattern, right? And I'd ask them what those are. And then I'd maybe even ask them, okay, why are they called what they are? I'll just write it out, why. So for the rectangular pattern, right, we got here, there, right? So I guess this would be more like that. What is this leg, right? I'd ask them, what is this leg? What's that leg? What's this leg? What's this leg? And what is this leg? Right, and that's what you'd ask them for the rectangular pattern. Okay, so here's our plane, and for our pattern work, right, let's say we're taking off from here, right? We're taking off going this way, right? So what would this first leg be? And for a student that I've had for at least a couple of lessons, and maybe if they've soloed especially, they'd say, okay, this is the upwind, right? Okay, great. What's this leg? Okay, this is the crosswind. So I can label these. Upwind. Say, okay, what is this? This is the crosswind. Right? This is the downwind. This is your base turn right here. And this is final. Right? And say, okay, great, you know what each of these legs are. Now, why are these legs the way that they are? Why do we name them upwind, crosswind, downwind, base, final, right? And this should be pretty self-explanatory, right? You have your upwind because you're flying into the wind, right? You're flying into the wind, and we take off on a runway into the wind so that we can have as much runway available to us as possible, right? Because if we have something resisting our force going that way, then we'll have a shorter takeoff distance necessary, which gives us the most available runway possible, right? So the wind in an upwind, generally, now obviously at Lafayette, it might be slightly crossed like that, but the general principle is that you're taking off into the wind. So it could be off a little bit here, off a little bit here, off a little bit here, whatever the case may be, but generally you're still taking off into at least somewhat of a headwind, right? So For the purposes of this lesson, we'll just say, okay, the wind is coming from here, right? The wind is coming from this direction, right? So that's where we're taking off into our upwind. Okay, so and this is going to be important for this lesson. Where is the wind coming from when we're in the crosswind, right? So, oh, the wind is coming from here, right? When we're in our crosswind, the wind is at a cross, is a crosswind, right? So it's coming from a 90-degree angle in I guess in this case, our right, off of our right shoulder, right? And then we go into the downwind, right? And it's important to realize what these winds are doing to each phase of our flight, right? And we'll talk about this in a little more detail in a minute, right? But just to emphasize, okay, where is the wind coming from in each of these legs? In the downwind, obviously the wind will be behind us, and we'll talk about how that affects performance and things like that. On our base, again, we'll have this crosswind right here. We'll have this wind coming from a 90-degree angle off of our left shoulder, right? And then our final will be we'll have a headwind again, right? So that is how a pattern works, right? And that is the overall review. And something that's also important to know is, okay, what does this look like at a non-towered airport, right? So in another lesson I've given, and maybe for the purposes of this lesson, that lesson wouldn't have been received by the student yet, but we talked about non-towered airports, non-towered airports, uncontrolled airspace, like in Class E airspace, right? Like at, I know, for example, White County, right? I believe it has a runway at 361A, right? But there's no tower, right? So there's not a little tower. There's not a tower, right? So how would we enter this pattern, right? How would entry work? What direction in the pattern would we go? And as a general rule of thumb, Class E airspace or Class E airports specifically, non-towered airports, they typically will have a left traffic pattern, right? So at White County, in CX White County, right? We're gonna enter, right? Let's say we're coming from the west, right? We're coming from the west. We're going to enter this downwind at a 45-degree angle, right here. So we're going to have this angle right here. This angle is around 45 degrees. It's a general rule of thumb, right? And you'll enter, you'll go base, final, right? You'll land, and we'll take off in this rectangular pattern. We'll come make left traffic and come back around, right? And that's how the traffic pattern works for most Class E airspace, for Class E airports, right? For non-towered airports. But that is a general rule of thumb. That is not always the case. And for the purposes today, I actually looked up an airspace where you will have a right pattern in a Class E airspace airport, right? Or in a non-towered airport. So for the purposes of this lesson, I'll show you what that exactly looks like, right? And how you can distinguish that on a sectional chart. So first of all, you can always go to the chart supplement for the airport of intended use, and you can look it up. And sure enough, it'll tell you whether it's left or right traffic, right? If specified, right? But for an airport I found in Pittsfield on a sectional chart, PSF for those of you following along, and on SkyVector or whatever, or your sectional chart or whatever you have. But this, let me show you right here. See how this airport, right, it has our ASOS frequency, it has landing lights, it's got elevation of the airport, all of these things, right? The control tower for the Unicom frequency, all these things, right? But you see this little RP right here? This indicates the right traffic pattern, right? So entering this Class E airspace specifically, you'll be performing right traffic for that pattern. So while in most Class E airspace, it is left traffic, there are the occasional instances where you'll have a right traffic Class E airspace airport, right? So it is very, very important to know what traffic you're in, because then, at a non-controlled airspace airport, it's important to know these things because you don't have people telling you what to do, and it causes confusion in the pattern for people who are also in the airspace. So knowing what the traffic is at a specific airport is very, very important. So with that being said, now in terms of the maneuver itself, the rectangular pattern, again, very, very similar to a pattern, right? So for this maneuver, it's important, one, to know where your wind is coming from, right? So let's say, for example, our wind's coming from the north again, or from wherever, right? And how do we enter this pattern, right? So first of all, we need to understand that we need to be 1,000 feet AGL, so above the ground, we need to be 1,000 feet, right? So that's not 1,000 feet MSL, so that's very, very important to know, right? You're not looking at your altimeter and saying, oh, well, I need to be down at 1,000 feet, because what if you don't have that amount of space, if you don't have that amount of distance from the ground? Because again, it's an MSL, right? So when we're at Lafayette and you're sitting on the ground and you're setting your altimeter and you're doing all your checks and stuff, what the altimeter should be reading is 606, right? Because that's your altitude in MSL, right? So it's important to know when you enter this maneuver what the ground level's at, right? So in Lafayette, it's a good rule of thumb that the surrounding practice areas are around 800 feet. MSL is what the ground level's at, right? So for taking that rule of thumb, 1,800 feet, and we're supposed to be 1,000 feet AGL, how high would we be entering this airspace? And for a student that I've had for a couple of lessons, we've hopefully gone over MSL and AGL and the differences. Hopefully, they would be able to state, well, we would obviously be 1,000 feet plus the 800, which is at the ground level, so we'd be at 1,800 MSL, right? They would correctly, hopefully, state that we'd be 1,800 MSL. And I'll move this for purposes of this. 1,800 MSL, right, which is 1,000 AGL, right? So that is very, very important, right? We don't want to get into a situation where, okay, we're 200 feet above the ground in this case, right? So for this maneuver, right, we're going to have the same principles, right? We're going to have the downwind, so the wind's coming from this direction. We're going to have the downwind, right? Downwind. We're going to have crosswind here, upwind here, crosswind here, and there you go, back to the downwind, right? So you have each of these legs, right? Right here, right? So that's our rectangular pattern. That's how it works. So as we said earlier, we have the altitude we need to be at. And for the Archer, the airspeed that we have entering the pattern should be at 90 knots, right? So we're trying to maintain that 90 knots indicated airspeed, right? We're maintaining 90 knots in the pattern, right? So 1,000 feet above the ground, AGL, remember that, 90 knots. And we got to find a good location for the maneuver. And you might ask, okay, what is an indication of a good place or a good area to perform such a maneuver, right? And a good case would be, first of all, you can use roads as reference, right? We'll talk about that a little later, right? We have these intersections and we have these roads, right? It might look something like this, right? You have all these roads, and then you can perform the rectangular pattern, and you want to do it in such a way where you have a field to land in case of an emergency, right? So we don't want to be doing this rectangular pattern to then have our engine fail and we're 1,000 feet above the ground and there's trees everywhere, right? That would not be ideal, and we would not have a suitable place for landing, and that would be a very, very dangerous situation that we wouldn't want to be in, right? So we'd find a field. Usually in Indiana, that's not an issue. There's a lot of fields around. We have usually nothing but fields in Indiana. So we're making sure we're finding one of these fields, right? And then we want to make sure when we're entering this pattern, we're entering it at a 45-degree angle in the downwind. So, right, we're coming here. We enter this 45-degree angle, right? Again, 45 degrees into the downwind, right? And we'll do down here, cross, up, cross, down. Right, and we'll just keep going in that rectangular pattern, right? And another thing I should have said, as is with all maneuvers, and if we've talked about any maneuvers up to this point, this is something that should have already been emphasized, but if this is the first maneuver that a student is becoming familiar with, this might be the first time they've ever heard this. So you can never emphasize enough when entering a maneuver, always make your clearing turns, right? Always make your clearing turns, always make sure you're clearing left, clearing right. So if you're coming at this pattern, if you're coming at this rectangular pattern, right, you're going to clear, you can clear 90 degrees to the left or 90 degrees to the right, whichever one you want to do, and then back on course, right, and then just keep flying, right? And we want to make sure the area is clear. We're clearing left, clearing right, clearing center, making sure there's no one else in the area that could interfere with our maneuver, right? So once we've cleared, once we've gotten down to 1,000 feet AGL, once we've gotten to 90 knots, we enter the pattern at the 45 degrees to the downwind, right? We'll start the maneuver. And again, understanding, so in a pattern, we have the upwind, the crosswind, the downwind, the base, the final defined for us, right? Because we're landing on our runway. So the thing that's important to recognize about a rectangular pattern is we don't necessarily have a runway, right? And we don't necessarily have a runway given to us either, of course, as well. So we want to make sure we know the direction the wind is coming from, right? And we can determine that visually, right? By if we're flying straight and we're being pushed to the right, we can know that our wind is coming from the left. We have a left crosswind, and same vice versa for a right crosswind, right? We push to the left. Or our ground speed's faster than our indicated airspeed, right? And all of those things can be indications of where our wind is coming from, right? If we have a faster ground speed, then we have a tailwind. If we have a lower ground speed, right, we'll have that headwind, right? So distinguishing in those ways, and in the Archer, in the G1000 system, there's this little wind indicator on the bottom left of the PFD, right? So those are all good resources to help us figure out where the wind's coming from. And once we do, right, then we'll know where to enter. So we're always entering with the tailwind, right? With the wind coming from this direction, this rectangular pattern, right? So, but then that brings up another thing that we should be considering when we're in this rectangular pattern, right? So as we're in this rectangular pattern, right, we're flying along, we're right here. We go into the downwind, life is great, right? We have this parallel wind, right, because it's our tailwind, but it's parallel to our direction of flight, right? Okay, so then what happens when we come here, right? How does the wind, and again, for a private student early on, they might not understand this concept yet, but I'd hopefully would be able to see them connect these dots. What would our airplane be doing once we entered here into this leg of the rectangular pattern with the wind coming from this direction, right? And hopefully they'll be able to see that, okay, as we talked about earlier, right, with stating where the winds are, we can talk about being blown off course and all those things. So what happens when we have a direct crosswind entering this leg? Well, we're going to be blown off in this direction, right? We're going to be blown off in that direction. So in order to counter the crosswind to maintain this rectangular pattern, we're going to need to crab into this wind a little bit, right? We're going to need to crab into this wind a little bit that way to keep us going straight, right? So that is something that is important to understand when we are entering this rectangular pattern, is where the winds come from and how they affect each phase of our flight. So this might be a place in my teaching to say, okay, now that we've demonstrated this, what happens when I'm in the downwind? Okay, we don't need any crab because we have a direct tailwind, right? What happens here? Hopefully they'll be able to understand where they need to crab into, and then you come back around here, or do we need to crab? No, we're into a headwind. Then we come back to this crosswind, and hopefully they'll be able to realize we're being pushed that way, right? So we're going to need to counteract that way, which will lead us back here, right? So hopefully they'll be able to understand those elements of a crosswind. Another thing that's very important about this maneuver is this is a very visual maneuver, right? So something that can be said about the altitude, right? We can use a cue, a visual cue for this maneuver to maintain an altitude without necessarily chasing the instruments inside of the aircraft. You're looking at the horizon, right? And you want to stay, when we're all hopefully trimmed out, that is something that we work on as well. We're trimmed out, entering this rectangular pattern, and we're fixing our eyes outside, seeing that sight picture at a level altitude, right, or straight and level. This is the picture. Hopefully they can maintain that sight picture, right? You can maintain that sight picture, and then you can reference your altimeter, right? But you're not necessarily focusing on the altimeter, right? You're keeping your eyes outside in relation to the horizon, every once in a while checking your altimeter, right? And those are all things that we can use in this pattern. So again, right, we have the upwind, both the crosswinds, the downwind, and how we're changing our bank throughout each of these as well is another thing that's important to distinguish, right? So as we roll out, we go into the downwind, right? We have this wind coming from the north, right? So in order to maintain this rectangular pattern, are we going to have a steeper bank here, right here? Or we're going to have a steeper bank here, rolling into these patterns, right? And hopefully they'd be able to realize, okay, going from having a tailwind to this crosswind, we're going to have to overcorrect with our bank, right? We're going to have a steeper bank here than we're going to have here, right? That is something that I would hope that they would be able to realize, and we would definitely walk through. And we'd walk through each of these legs and approximately how much bank you'd have to have coming into it, like in relation to each other, right? The intensity of the wind is going to play a role into it. If it's a heavy wind day or a light wind day, a calm day, you won't need any really correction in bank. It's a similar bank throughout if it's a calm wind day, as opposed to a heavy wind day. You're definitely going to have a lot more of that correction in there, right? And then so we would maneuver this way, and understanding, okay, if our engine were to fail, we would just treat this like a pattern, and we would land in this field right here, hopefully into this headwind, right? And then also, again, we would reference our instruments to make sure we're at where we need to be, but those would be references, and those would not be the primary sight picture, as we talked about earlier. And then once we complete, we would exit this just like a takeoff, right? We would exit it right here into the upwind, and we climb off as necessary, right? And as we climb, we're going to do all the things that we do. We're going to check our climb checklists. And then when we go up to cruise altitude, we're going to use our cruise checklist and all of those things, right? The cues, like we talked about earlier, reference these railroads or they don't necessarily have to be railroads or state roads or whatever it may be, so that we know, right? For example, if we go into this downwind, right, and we come out, we don't have enough of that bank to maintain it. We'll see, we have crossed this road, right? And then that will give us those visual sight pictures and those visual cues of where we need to be. And if we have roads like this, we'll be able to understand, okay, we need to be inside of these parameters. So if we go outside, we'll be able to see that we are not performing this rectangular pattern in a desired way, right? So using these visual references of roads or trees, roads are definitely going to be the best one because they're set in stone. They're roads, right? They're going to be directly lined up with each other, as opposed to if you were to choose a tree, right? If you choose a tree, a little tree, and then a little tree maybe here, it's not necessarily as good of a sight picture as these roads would be. So making sure you're picking good sight pictures, right, to give you a reference of where your rectangular pattern needs to be. So you know, okay, when I come out of this downwind to this crosswind, I know that I'm going to need to be inside of this road, right? And when I come outside of this crosswind to this upwind, I'm going to be inside of this road, right? And if we veer off here, we know we need to correct and come back here, right? And all these things, the same. If we're inside of these roads, these visual sight pictures will be able to help us reference where we need to be, for sure. Common errors that are prevalent in new students especially are, again, as we've talked about in detail, using the instruments. And I would argue that everyone, especially for beginners, are guilty of this, right? We're guilty of wanting to meet these ACS standards to a point where we're so focused on the instruments and not falling out of that range that we need to be in to pass a check ride or pass a stage check or anything of that sort, right? that we lose the skill of being able to, and the other reference points of looking out and flying visually, right? Especially for VFR flight operations for a private applicant, right? It is important to be able to use these sight pictures to help you fly, and it will make you a better pilot. And often, more than not, when you chase this instrumentation, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy sense, where if you're focusing on the instruments and staying inside of standards, whether it be the lag of the instruments or you not understanding where you are in space, you'll usually have a harder time staying within those standards, chasing the instruments, than you will actually visually knowing the cues and knowing where you're at, right? So we definitely use the instrumentation as a reference, but make sure we're using those sight pictures. Again, we've already talked about improper drift correction, right, is another thing. Improper crosswind and drift correction is a big thing that people can also get wrong. But understanding how we can correct this with having these visual points and understanding where we are in space will help us understand, okay, I am drifting too much. Or right, if we come in here, okay, I've gotten too far away from this road, right? And it helps us to be able to account for these errors and be able to adjust accordingly, having these. So in order to mitigate these errors, maybe not necessarily get rid of them, because I don't believe an error can completely go away, but to mitigate them as much as possible, we can use these visual points for drifting errors. And with that, I believe that is all I have. In a post-flight discussion, I might walk them through, okay, again, what are the names of these legs, and how do we accomplish things, and if the wind were to change, right, if it were to come from maybe this way, okay, then how would we account for drift correction and stuff of that nature, right? Is something that I would ask them. I would challenge them with the non-standard, right, not to a crazy extent, right, but to help them conceptualize and really understand what was being said and not just memorize, okay, and my instructor said the wind's coming from this way, this is automatically the downwind, right? Okay, what if the wind changes and it's over here? This is no longer the downwind, right? So I would help them to really get a grasp of what is going on in the rectangular pattern. With that being said, that's all I have. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully I'll see you in another video soon.